Welcome to Let's Talk Color.
I'm Amy Woolf, Principal Designer at Amy Woolf Color and Design.
And I'm Amy Krane, Founding Designer at Amy Krane Color. We're both professional color experts who specialize in architectural color. We met while training, and years later, the conversation is still going strong.
We both live our lives immersed in color and design. We often agree, but sometimes we don't, because color is personal. Color truths, however, are universal.
In each episode, we'll unravel the mystery of choosing color for your home or business, both inside and out.
Today, our topic is trim, and I want to thank one of our listeners for writing in with a suggestion. So, by request, today's going to be all about trim color. And we're going to go beyond the idea of just white because, there is actually no such thing as just white, given that there's hundreds of whites to choose from. And I think we'll start by talking about what trim actually is. Carpenters and builders will refer to it as millwork. It includes your baseboards, door casings, crown molding, but also built-in things like cupboards or wainscoting. Wainscoting? What do you call it, Amy? Wainscoting or wainscoting?
I say wainscoting.
Okay.
I also think we should include, those beautiful old plaster walls you'll see in a pre-war apartment or something where panels are created by decorative molding within the wall that give you an opportunity to not only paint that molding a color, but also paint inside the molding, perhaps a different color than the rest of the wall. So
good point. Like a big giant picture frame on the wall. Yeah, right.
Exactly. So I think you hit it. I think that's about all of it.
Okay.
It's people struggle with choosing trim color unless they just want to repeat what they had before. It's wood stain, and they wouldn't even consider painting the wood, and we could talk about that later. Or they only know white, so they think, what do you mean? What do you want to do for trim? I always ask, any ideas what you want to do for trim? They don't even consider that there are quite a number of other treatments for trim.
I can't tell you how many times I've walked into a house and we've looked at the trim color, and I will often ask a client to tell me, what have they got in the basement? Let's take a look at those paint cans and see if we can ID the trim color, particularly when we're going to go with what's already been done, repeat the same color. And many, many, many times it's just straight Benjamin Moore white, ready mix interior white. And I think that, while that's fine, and I think bright white trim certainly has its place, I have a lot of it in my own life, I think there's an opportunity there to do something a little more interesting, a little more different, but not so different. I'm a strong believer in picking one color that's going to work throughout the house, just for the sake of sanity, just because it makes touch-ups easier and less confusing. So
all one color definitely also helps with the cohesion in the house. It's just, you've got that one element that is continuing from room to room and floor to floor, and it really helps tie a house together. But there are a number of reasons to do something different than white in every room. But it certainly adds complexity to the overall palette of the house, the design of the house. But certainly certain kinds of architecture lends itself to having different color trim. More historical houses with large, wide decorative trim are often treated by painting the trim a different color than the walls, and sometimes a different color from room to room. I think maybe a good thing to do is to just do a run-through of the various choices that you might have in terms of the treatment of your trim. There's the traditional choice of white or off-white. There's wood stain trim, which often goes hand in hand with a more rustic type of house. There are very modern homes that don't have trim at all. They don't have molding. They have what's called drywall return. So in that scenario, it's a very sleek, modern look, and you don't have any interruption of the eye as you look down and up in a room and from room to room and all of that, because there's absolutely no trim. And then there's the treatment you might choose for a historical home. And one of the lovely things about historical homes is the trim. In fact, the casing around the doors and the windows, it can be highly decorative, and often it's quite wide. And it's a great opportunity to jump in there with either a different color altogether than the wall. It can be a different color, it can be a lighter color, it can be a darker color, or you can take a historical home with wide decorative trim and in fact paint it the same color as the walls, which is a very modern, newer treatment in terms of what to do with your trim.
I think where I have seen most of that all one color application is with the use of really bold color in historic homes. We're seeing, these rooms with a ton of millwork or molding and it's either done in teal or, something like that. But actually the truth is I did a library a few years back that was, floor to ceiling paneling, and the whole room just got, swathed in one color. It was gray because we hadn't moved beyond the gray trend yet. This was probably 5 or 6 years ago. But I think what you're talking about with also colorful trim is that classic colonial look, which I certainly see a great deal of up here in Massachusetts, where the walls tend to be sort of an off-white or maybe a putty color, probably hearkening back to raw plaster or a lime wash. And then the trim itself was painted a color. And so we often see that, like a putty wall and, colonial blue trim, which of course I think we can improve on. We can do a little better than that classic colonial blue, which I know some people really don't like. Sage green, barn red, those were sort of the defaults, I believe, in, shall we say, New England style. But I always think about that in terms of the ratio, kind of like the value relationship, lighter walls, darker trim versus darker walls and white trim. I had a house that I worked on when I first moved up here to Massachusetts that was an accurate replica of a 1600s house, and the windows were 12 over 12s or 16 over 16. Which when I say 12 over 12, what I mean is 12 panes of glass with mullions in between on the top half of the double hung window and 12 panes of glass on the bottom. So that's a lot of wood. It's a lot of mullions, a lot of woodwork. And so my client really came from a home where she had color on the walls and white trim and wanted to bring that look with her and replicate that. And I kind of drew a line in the sand and said, no, we can't do that with all those mullions, have all that white trim. First of all, it'll stop your eye from really moving beyond all that woodwork out into the views. And they really bought the property not just for the house, but for the setting in those views. But also, I think for these kind of traditional colonial houses, I really believe we've internalized the way they should look. And we have a certain sense that white trim on that style of house just doesn't make sense. And it would feel, and it would somehow feel strange to walk into, a house like that and find white trim everywhere,
Yeah, I think the question of what to do with the mullions is a big one. And also people struggle, should my outside window mullions match my inside window mullions? You certainly don't have to. You made a really good point in terms of white on your mullions, also known as muntins, stopping your eye from going out to the view. Anything dark framing a window is going to send your eye straight out. So you will be looking straight past those mullions out to the outdoors. And it's really a helpful trick to emphasize the exterior view in a room. And I think that that's one happy byproduct of our recent-ish trend in black windows that you're seeing now with the modern farmhouse look, which so many other kinds of homeowners want also. If they have the opportunity to change the windows, either they're replacing the windows or just painting the windows, a lot of people are asking for black on the windows. Are you finding that, Amy?
It's a little slow to catch on here in Western Massachusetts. I certainly am seeing a whole lot of black going up on the exteriors. I think it's more of a stretch for the interiors. I have one client right now who's doing a modern barn, and he is putting black on the interior, and oddly, I think the exterior is all white, which is kind of interesting. And he's doing, what you mentioned before, the very a simple return. There will not be casing around those windows. I have another client right now who's doing replacement windows, and she has wood for her interior casing. And of course, we're struggling with what to do for the interior finish on those windows. The stain, let's say coated finish that comes from the manufacturer, their Marvin windows, is a yellow pine, the natural wood, and it's very yellow. And her casing has aged over time, and it's probably been finished maybe 20 years ago, so it's ambered and it's quite orange. So white doesn't feel right. The yellow pine doesn't feel quite right. I have suggested black. Have not heard back from her on that idea. I think it's a stretch. I think it's hard for her to wrap her head around. The analogy I use is the iron fence in the garden versus a white picket fence. I don't know if we've talked about that before. But if you're looking at a garden and there's a black iron fence around the garden, what do you see? You don't see the iron fence. It disappears. You see the garden. Whereas if there's a white picket fence between you and the garden, the white stops your eye. So that's how I like to describe it to my clients, this notion of the view and white and black. And obviously that works with any kind of toned color. I think in an ideal world, my client really likes her wood trim. And I think in an ideal world, what we're going to end up doing is probably having the new replacement windows custom stained to match the existing older trim. She's a self-professed nature girl, a nature lover, and really likes the natural wood. So I think we're going to stick with what she loves and probably aim for that. But the black would work.
I want to make a distinction between the window sashes and mullions and the window frame or casing, because you can have the window itself, meaning the sashes and the mullions, be the black or another color, any color, and have your window frames or the casing match your trim. So yes, it is a third color, but third color meaning wall color, window frame and sill color, sashes and mullion color. But if you're talking neutrals, if the window sashes and mullions are black, it's a color, but it's really quite a neutral, which to some degree disappears as we're talking about your eye passing right through it to the outdoors. What parts of the room do you like to specify with trim? For me, I think of doors at the same time as I think of trim, and I very, very, very often specify doors, trim, and windows being the same thing. I like to see color in masses in a room, and so I'm not a huge fan of having the trim, be it the molding, the base molding, continue up around the door and having that a different color than the door. In other words, I don't really care for matching the door to the walls with the trim being something different, because it's a line. If you forget about what it is, forget that it's molding and just look at its pattern, its visual impact, it's a line. It's a line traveling along the bottom and then up around doors and back down and door after door, up and around, up and around, up and around. I would rather have the door, look at the door as a mass of color, as a block of color, and color it the same as the trim, with exceptions here and there. For instance, I've I remember specifying color for an apartment in New York City, and the hallway was rather large and rectangular. And so to have 6 doors be a different color than the walls, it was too busy for me. And certainly to just line each door with just a trim color, I didn't like it either. So that for me is definitely a scenario where you might want to go with trim matching wall color. So it's all in one, and your eyes don't go immediately to this door, that door, or even worse, all the doors in that little space. I do like painting trim and walls the same color, and I do suggest it to clients very often. I think it's a really seamless look, and the thing to consider also is that not everyone's trim is beautiful. You know, those historic houses with the 6-inch tall, beautiful decorative trim is one thing. But if you've got very ordinary trim, I mean, who says you should call it out and bring it to people's attention? I think it's nice just to let it set back often, give it a different finish, a different shine, and call it a day. Match the walls.
I can think of 2 cases where I've used that technique pretty effectively. One would be where we're thinking about wayfinding and doors that are functional and doors that we want to see. If they're, sometimes I'll do this on an exterior, actually, where there's a secondary entry door off to the side that you don't want to steer your visitors to. I will often paint that door out in the same color as the field of the house, this, same as essentially the walls. And I'll do it in a kitchen if there's a utility closet, or, something that we don't need to be aware of. Obviously, an entry or an exit door, that's about wayfinding. We want to see that. I have also done it in a long hallway in a ranch house. Sort of, this is my analog to your New York City apartment. If there's, a long hallway running down the middle of a ranch house with all these doors, instead of doing, color white, color white, color white, I will often just wrap that whole hallway in that single wall color, doors and trim. And you're right, take it up a step in sheen for the trim so you've got the durability. So we should talk a little bit about sheen, and I want to kind of build on what you said about important trim. One of the things I think about, my general rule of thumb, I'll just start with that, is that we take at least 1, but usually 2 steps up in sheen from the wall finish to the trim. So if you're doing a matte on the walls, which is my favorite choice for most situations, then I would go 2 steps up, and that is to a satin. So we skip over eggshell and go to satin. You can also go to semi-gloss if you like that. But the way I consider sheen is first of all, what's the condition of your trim? What's the condition of your millwork? Because the more shine you have, the more details you'll see. And also, is that trim important? Like you were talking about, Amy, with, historic, beautiful, detailed trim. More sheen is going to show more detail, for better or for worse.
Yeah, I'm in complete agreement with you. The one place that I do steer towards a shinier finish than satin or pearl is, again, in a New York City apartment, having lived in one for so many years. I know the amount of grime. It's not just dust. It's with all of the traffic and the pollution and everything. I'm sorry, New York City. It's the kind of dust that sticks. I mean, it's soot. And I think that that's one reason to get yourself up a notch and go with the shinier trim in a city like New York. So I often do semi-gloss there. I think, between just its durability, basically about its durability, making it easier to wipe down all the time. As you said, it's a harder finish. It lasts longer. And, if you're a vacuumer like me, man, I bump those moldings all the time. Mine should be made of steel.
That's one more reason to have your trim color choice be uniform throughout and rational. So you can go run around with a Q-tip and touch up all those little ding marks easily, which I'm going to confess I usually only do before I'm selling my house. But I aspire to do that more often in my dreams, right? So...
Right, right. And what about one thing that often trips people up are jams. How to describe a jam? A jam is a section of window casing or a door or the divider between rooms, which is perpendicular to the walls or surfaces it connects to. So it's the width. It's the width of the thing you're looking at. It's the space between the two rooms, if there's an opening between two rooms, and it's that side, that inside side of your window casing. God, I don't know if I confuse people more than not, but if one room, the trim color is whatever, wood tone, and the next one it's white, or anything, gray then white, or whatever it is, what do? And also on the door, there are often occasions for doors to be a different color on each side. Think of a bathroom door. One side's one color, the other side's your hallway color, and any other room. So my answer is this. Look at which room the door opens into. When the door is kept open, which side is it in? Which room is it in? Is it in the hallway? Is it in the bedroom? And paint the color of the room that the door is opened into, because that's the room that you're most going to see. And with trim, like for instance, a very wide entrance from room to room, in other words, it isn't an open plan where there's literally no break between room, but it's very wide doorway without a door. I will again paint the jam the color that I'm most often walking in the house. So,
yeah, I will say that is one place I kind of break my only one trim color rule, that I often find that bathrooms want a brighter white trim, and I will do a more toned white everywhere else in the house except the bathroom. That somehow to bring a toned white into a bathroom where there's so many bright white fixtures, because we're not going to be doing biscuit toilets on my watch. You know, one white to another white is one thing, but one color to another color is quite another thing. I heard years ago that the way to do those transitions from room to room was to do it so that, this is so hard to describe, but basically imagine yourself like walking through the house, like let's just use a shotgun house for an example where you've got rooms stacked on each other. And you start with a general flow of traffic from the front door to the back door, and you wrap from one room to the next in the direction of traffic that you're mostly going. So this really also applies to like cased, openings that are not cased also. Openings that are just plastered, where sometimes you'll have an archway or an opening between rooms. So if you walk in the house and you're in the living room, as you walk into the next room, the dining room, let's say, you're going to wrap that living room onto the 90-degree walls. So this is one time I guess I wish we had a YouTube channel, because we're here flapping our wings and making motions with our hands. And dear listeners, we hope you get it. Anyway, and I would say generally just pick something and stick with it. I often will tell clients, when it comes to these kind of weird splitting hairs kind of conversations, these choices that need to be made, I will often say that there is no absolutely one right choice, and that we can follow the guidelines and follow the rules and see how it feels, and kind of take it from there. I think this also has to do with value of the color, lightness, darkness. That, if we're moving from one room that's a very dark color into another room that's a really light color, I think it makes the decision harder. And sometimes you just have to try it out and see how it feels. And just know that there is no absolute one right answer.
That's fair. I think that's fair. Let's roll back a sec and talk a little bit more about that wood trim, because you and I, Amy, we kind of chuckle about this quite often. Wood stained trim and the love affair of it with so many males in our society. I'm not being disrespectful in any way to men here. I'm just saying, why do they love the wood trim so much? And why do the the female in the house are game to paint it a color, even if that color is white. Like, yeah, let's get rid of that wood trim. And the men are like, not over my dead body. It's so universal. It's unbelievable. It's like, it's sacred. It's, I don't know. Is it from wood shop? Did they have wood shop in junior high? Did they learn to appreciate wood, and maybe they have a little bit of carpentry skills and they have a great love and appreciation for wood? I mean, maybe it comes from, I bet it does come from a really beautiful place of sort of honoring nature and trees and all, but it's so monolithic, and it's so there. And I have never asked a man, why don't you want to paint that wood trim? And I would love to hear the answer. Maybe I'll do it one day.
Oh, because it's wrong. It's wrong. I mean, what I find with guys who don't want to paint wood, whether it's the trim or the kitchen cabinets or whatever, there's just something inviolable about it. It's just wrong. I have a theory that's not quite as beautiful as communing with nature bit. And that theory is that it has somewhat to do with the dislike of change. I think it kind of plays out in the haircut world. You know, you come home and you say to your guy, what do you think of my hair? And he's like, I liked it the other way. You know, there's a part of me that sort of feels like guys just aren't as open to change. I do also think that the yearning for white trim is also a yearning for more ease with color. I think it's so much easier to pick a wall color when you have white trim. So I think that if you want to split this along the lines of who's interested in design in the house and who is less so, and that can fall either way on the gender line in partnerships. But I know that very often people who want to get rid of their wood trim, a big reason for that is because they have struggled with wall color, because it is really much harder, I think, to pick good wall colors to go with wood trim. Wouldn't you say that's true? Yeah.
I agree. Oh, yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's actually one of my blog posts that I did years ago, and I get so many hits on it. It's, picking wall. Yeah, exactly. Picking wall color for wood trim. But, Amy, it goes back to something you said in our kitchen episode, which I totally agree with. It's that people may think of the wood color as neutral, but the reality is they're looking at a color, and then suddenly, as you said, it can skew brown or reddish brown or orange or orangey brown or yellow or gray or whatever, and it's all over the room, and so it's a major component in the design of that room, and it complicates choosing the wall color without a doubt.
And I think so often a lot of the trim is oak. We see so much orangey oak trim or ambered pine trim in so many houses. And that's a lot of color.
It is.
It's not like people are doing walnut.
Right.
Or a cool birch. We're not seeing that. We're seeing a lot of orange, a lot of yellow, and that's a responsibility. That's a burden. So
it is always a bummer when folks don't want to paint the trim just because budget-wise they can't. And although it might be an okay shape, if it's very often a screaming bright white. And it just makes me sad because I don't really want a screaming bright white so often. Sometimes, but not so often. But, budget is budget. And if you can't, to continue that into rooms, some other rooms that do need trim to be done, and you're forced into using that white that you don't think is so great because budget-wise that's what they have to do. And that's reality. It is what it is.
I think the thing about trim is that there's just a ton of labor involved. It's a lot of really fussy work. And so it is time consuming. I think the other thing to remember, though, is that, if your trim looks okay now, people ask me this about ceilings also. When everything got painted at once, the trim, the walls, the ceiling, they've all sort of gone downhill together. they've all tracked and gotten worse looking together. And so when you then add some fresh new paint, like on the walls, it's that juxtaposition between the new, clean, fresh paint job on the walls that's going to make the trim look a lot shabbier.
Right.
So either, do the Q-tip thing, or, maybe try to budget for getting the trim painted the next year. Or if you're handy and you get snowed in, which only counts for half of the country, it can be a DIY.
Or pandemicked in.
There you go. It can be a DIY project if it's something you like. So let's talk about sheen again real quick. Another thing to talk about with sheen is that if you are DIYing your trim, if you aren't painting every day for a living and you're an amateur, the shinier the paint, the harder it is to get it to apply well and look good. So if you are not the best painter and you end up with brush drags and stuff like that, a little less sheen will be your friend. So, and you can ask me
Good
how
point.
I know that.
How do you know that, Amy?
My very first house, my very first experiment, where I learned so much, including the fact that I learned that I needed to get trained in color. I decided semi-gloss was, God, did I use semi-gloss? I might have used high gloss. And it was not easy. Yeah, it was not easy.
Let's talk about pet peeves.
Pet peeves? Do we have pet peeves?
Yes, a couple. Not so many with trim, but a couple. I don't mind so much if there's different trim in some different rooms. If the trim in every single room is different, that is too much for me. I think that really fights the idea of cohesion in your house. So I would say, if you want variety from room to room, still come up with a plan and pick a few colors and work it out that way. I think, if you've got 11 rooms in your house, you really don't need to have 11 different trim colors if they're different than the wall. If they are the same color as the wall, then that's fine. It just blends in with your wall, and it's not standing out, and it doesn't create that super busy situation. And I guess the other thing is, going back to what we said before, you've got 1.5 inch, absolutely nothing looking trim. If it's really uninteresting, really consider not emphasizing the look of your trim with a different trim color. And you shouldn't just do it because you think you should. Make sure your trim is nice enough to be called out with its own color. How about you, Amy?
I think my big pet peeve, and this is something I probably see more on exteriors than interiors, but I think it's a mistake, is when, this would be an exterior trim pet peeve. When people paint the house a certain field color and then they decide to use a lighter version for the trim. So there's a house near me. Boy, I hope that person isn't listening. And it's a rich yellow. It's really a lovely home. And the trim is a pale yellow instead of a white. And I just feel like it's one of those shortcuts that you shouldn't take. For me, I don't know. Yeah. And I suppose my other pet peeve about trim is that, and it goes to interior, I want trim to kind of, if it's going to be white, I want it to feel clean and fresh. I think you can still tone a trim color, but keep it clean feeling. I tend to stay away from the muddier whites, just because for me, somehow if we're going to do white, I want it to kind of sparkle. It doesn't have to be bright and stark, but it should still read clean.
Makes sense. Well, thanks for listening.
Thanks again to our dear listener who wrote in and asked us to talk about trim. You can find us on our website, letstalkpaintcolor.com. And there's a place where you can send us a little note. So let us know what you'd like to hear us talk about next.